With plans now taking shape for a permanent base at the moon's south pole, NASA says the next decade will focus on turning short-term missions into a lasting human presence beyond Earth. The $20 billion project will unfold in 3 phases. The first phase, running through 2029, will focus on gathering detailed data and ensuring reliable access to the lunar surface. As part of preparations, 3 uncrewed missions will take place this year. Phase 2, from 2029 to 2032, will establish the base's initial operating capability, allowing astronauts to begin living and working on the moon for extended periods. Then, by the 3rd phase, which is to begin in 2032, NASA aims to establish a sustained presence with regular crew rotations and continuous operations on the lunar surface becoming reality. And NASA says the moon base will cover hundreds of square miles and will include hopping drones and rovers that will carry astronauts around the site. It would also become the world's first permanent outpost on another celestial body, serving as both a scientific hub and a testing ground for future deep space missions.
With Moonbase, Artemis astronauts will stay longer, explore farther, and conduct the kinds of science that advances exploration itself, understanding how humans operate off-world, how we build infrastructure, and how we prepare for Mars.
For more on these lunar ambitions, we're being joined by David Paige, professor of planetary science at the Department of Earth, Planetary, and Space Sciences at UCLA. And Professor Paige helps NASA map the moon's temperatures and potential ice-bearing regions. So, Professor Paige, we're hearing some exciting news, but let's break down the science behind all this and whether NASA's plans are actually plausible by looking at the lunar South Pole. You've worked on identifying South Pole areas where buried ice could be stable while still having enough sunlight and Earth visibility. But based on such data, do you think the South Pole is still the right place, or the safest place to build a base?
Well, the lunar South Pole has been of interest probably for the last 50 years. And it's only recently that we've begun to really start to explore it as well as to understand it. It's interesting about the moon because most of the moon, it's pretty much like we've seen with the Apollo astronauts, but there are a few places of real estate on the moon that are of particular interest, both from the scientific perspective as well as looking for resources that might ultimately sustain, a permanent human presence. And one of those is definitely at the South Pole of the moon. We have good reason to suspect that there may be some ice buried below the surface inside these permanently shadowed regions. These are places inside impact craters that never receive any direct sunlight. And because of that, they're extremely cold and are cold enough to preserve ice over billions of years. So understanding the distribution of that ice and how accessible it might be is one of the main goals of our present planetary and space exploration program.
Right. And before we talk about how accessible it is and whether astronauts can actually use it to sustain life there, help break it down. Is the moon's water ice sitting like blocks of ice mixed into soil? How does it look?
Well, you're asking some very good questions there. We have only sort of we have a good theoretical case that it ought to be there. And we've actually found a lot of ice on the planet Mercury near its poles, surprisingly. Even though it's very close to the sun, it has a similar type of lighting situation at its poles, and we know there's lots and lots of water there on Mercury. So we do expect to see some ice at the poles, but exactly how much and how deep below the surface and how it's mixed into the soil, these are still unknowns. And this is certainly one of the major scientific goals of the Artemis program, is to better understand these particular issues.
Mm-hmm. And what do we know as of now? How confident are we that the ice there could help the astronauts sustain life?
Well, it's a big step between finding some ice and then figuring out a way to use it in an engineering sense to actually sustain life. But the possibility that it's there, I think, is enough incentive to go explore, because it costs so much money to bring things to the moon. And if you can find a resource there that you can use, that will make the process a lot more economically feasible than it might be otherwise.
And I want to talk about, apart from the economical, this is still an ongoing discovery. NASA wants drones and rovers to scout landing sites. What exactly are they looking for that orbital cameras right now cannot already tell us?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the very strange lighting angles that you get at the high latitudes on the moon. The sun is basically very close, if not on the horizon, when it's up. And so as a consequence, there's a lot of terrain that is shadowed or barely in shadow. And to plan like an astronaut sortie or a rover traverse, you need to have much more detailed information than we currently have. And so these preliminary uncrewed missions will sort of lay the groundwork literally for those more detailed missions, and also hopefully find the most favorable places to go look. Because currently we know that there's some very large areas inside large impact craters that are likely to have major deposits of ice, but those places are probably not that hospitable to humans because there's literally no sunlight. And so what NASA is looking for is an area that's close to a place that has sunlight, yet is one of these cold, permanently shadowed areas that they can sort of go into and look around, especially from the perspective of a rover or an astronaut, because you don't want to stray too far away from the sunlight for obvious reasons.
And it's coming at a time when it's still a space race. China also aiming a crewed moon landing by the year 2030. And NASA outlined the years 2029 to 2032. It seems that there are many sensitive variables to consider, but just how realistic are all these variables to be considered in the timeline that both sides are proposing?
Well, I think it's pretty well appreciated that NASA has set up a very exciting but also a very ambitious plan. And, if you simply add up the amount of money it currently costs to send an astronaut, into orbit around the moon, like they have recently done with the very successful Artemis 2 mission, if you sort of, project those costs forward, it's very, very, very expensive. So what they're really hoping to do is to figure out a way to do this in a much more cost-effective manner than it's been done before. And one of the key approaches is, of course, to rely on industry to provide the vehicles and the support infrastructure to make this work. And, many see this as a test of whether or not this approach is ultimately going to be successful and move us on to a period where there is a permanent human presence on the moon.
Professor Paige, final question to you. You're part of the new projects that NASA is conducting. Then what would you like to see, or what measurement do we need to see from the lunar surface before NASA commits to a permanent base site?
Well, I would love to see a bunch of ice, and who knows whether that'll even happen in the next 5 years or 10 years. But I think identifying and understanding what's there in terms of the ice, maybe bringing a sample of it back to Earth and studying it in laboratories here, I think that would be especially exciting from the standpoint of finding out whether this entire plan is going to work.
All right. Well, hoping to see some blocks of ice there. Thank you so much. That was Professor David Paige at the Planetary Science at the Department of Earth, Planetary, and Space Sciences at UCLA.